let us continue. We'll get back to this thing in a second. Where are we? Where's my notes? Notes right here. We've been talking about, last week we talked about this fragment right here, the Gospel of John, chapter 18, its significance. It's only a little scrap of 5 verses. We don't even have the full 5 verses. We just have pieces of it because the fragments tore up. But it's so important because it moves the timeline of the New Testament indisputably earlier, and a whole bunch of arguments about that were assumed to be true by what is often called the historical critical school, the Tübingen school. We talked about it last week. The sort of philosophy of biblical study that guys like Ferdinand Christian Bauer in the 18th, all these people you never heard of that you still deal with today. A lot of the fights you fight regarding and the hostility and the adversity that you see against, or hostility against the Bible and so forth, have their roots in the 1800s with the rise of these critical methods of studying the Bible. And boy, this little dinky fragment. Interesting that it was found just after all of that happened. It would have been interesting if it would have been found before Bauer in the middle of the 1800s. How would it have changed the history of biblical studies if this little dinky fragment had been found prior to Bauer going to that university and doing what he did? We'll never know. But at any rate, we're going to start from there and move on. This begins then after the New Testament period closes. After John's writings, John, Revelation, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, which are generally assumed to be written roughly at the same time, at the end of the 1st century, at the end of the aughts. You got the hundreds. I don't know what you call the century before. If the hundreds, 200s, 300s are the next 3 centuries, what do you call from 0 to 100? I don't know. The aughts. The Brits call the 2000s. That's the knots. They call it the naughties. I don't know. Anyway, so now we move on, and we got to get the text from that original writing. You can seem like a precarious process, right? Because at this point, all you have is papyrus, which is very fragile and decomposes very easily under almost any circumstances. So one way or another, you have to get far enough into the future. Something has to change. Because if we didn't have what we'll see in a little bit is the great parchment codices, the great parchment manuscripts that will come in the 300s, boy, it'd be tough going. Because other than those codices that we'll talk about, everything is highly fragmentary. And so you'd have to piece this together, literally one little fragment at a time. Or you do something else, which is, we have it as fragmentary. We have these manuscripts as fragmentary, but the early church fathers that wrote on the New Testament, they did biblical studies, they did biblical interpretation. They quoted from the New Testament books all the time. So they had full manuscripts. In the second, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, these people, they had full manuscripts. We're going to talk about the Muratorian canon today, which you probably never heard of, but from our vantage point, it's fragmentary. From their vantage point, they have the books. They're not necessarily all together as a collection of 27 like we have them, but they have them. They consider them canon, so to speak, inspired, authoritative, and they wrote on them and they quoted them. And even if we didn't have the New Testament books, if none of it survived in the original Greek, we could piece it together from the quotes of the early church fathers, all of it, many, many times over. You wouldn't necessarily have the verses and so forth because that came later. Remember when these manuscripts were written, there's no spaces necessarily between the words. There's no punctuation to make it easier to figure out when one thought ends and one thought begins. But this was their native language, so they didn't have a problem with it, which is why it would have been written that way. But it's all there in the church fathers. But you would have to do text work on those quotes, because this father quotes it this way and this other father quotes it that way. Which one do you want? How do you know which one is closer to the original, right? You also have, which we'll talk about, the Latin versions, the Latin copies, and we can do it from that as well. But we don't have to, because we have an extraordinary richness of manuscript evidence in our tradition, in the original language, in Greek, handed down decade after decade, century after century, from the hundreds all the way through till the printing press, till they start rolling off the printing press. So that's what we're going to do today. We'll just look at some of this stuff in the hundreds, 200s, and then maybe get to the 300s there. That's going to be the period of papyrus, the papyri fragments. Papyri is plural, although I heard somebody online call it papyrus. I've never heard that before. A funny YouTube channel I found called the League of Biblical Enthusiasts. And he goes, welcome to, and he's got League of Biblical Enthusiasts across the top of his thing. He's a guy probably in his 60s or 70s. Welcome to the League of Biblical Enthusiasts. He points up at it. It's pretty fun, but he's got some pretty good content. Anyway, so let's talk about some of this and why it matters. All of these papyrus fragments, I'll use the singular with fragments because I think papyri sounds funny. It doesn't sound like a real word. We've got a bunch of it. Probably, I've heard anything from 60 to 120 fragments of New Testament books still existing in extant, is what it's called when you say existing. Extant is the word you're going to see in literature. 60 to 120 or something extant manuscripts that survive to this day, but they're all fragmentary. And two of the most important finds were those two that you see there up at the top, Bodmer and Chester Beatty. They were both collectors. So you have manuscript hunters, which we'll talk about later when we get to von Tischendorf in the 1900s. Very important New Testament scholar, manuscript hunter, who will be eerily parallel to the story of Indiana Jones, his story. And that whole manuscript hunting thing will be eerily parallel to what you see in Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first Indiana Jones movies. I think Spielberg did that a lot. He would use composites of real life and use those pieces to piece together his movies. So, here and there, I've already actually got some quotes up from the movie, and you read these quotes and you go, man, that's awful close. But that's for a later time. Anyway, you have these two sets of manuscripts. We're just going to look at it, and where we're just going to mention it, talk about it and its importance, and move on. These are the early 1900s. These collectors have these manuscripts. They buy them. They're all wealthy collectors, and so they literally, their hobby, Jay Leno's hobby is cars. So I don't know how many cars he has, but they're not Volkswagens. They're hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he bids on them here and there in auctions, and antique car, not antique, but vintage cars and so on and so forth. And he loves showing off his cars. You go to look at his collection of cars. Takes them out on speedways, NASCAR speedways and so forth, certain of them. But these guys were the same way with their manuscripts, with their collections of artifacts, archaeological artifacts. And so Chester Beatty was one of these guys. He was an American. He was was it copper magnate? Magnate means rich guy. Magnate means a guy who's really into a thing and made a lot of money off of it. So this magnet was copper, I think. Anyway, so he's got this world-class library of artifacts. And at some point in the 50s, maybe, I don't remember, he donated that collection. Ireland. He's Irish. Irish American, I think. So he ends up donating the collection. So you can go view it in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, which I think I was in 2020. I went to Ireland and I went to Trinity College. And I should have looked this up. I wanted to look at the manuscripts, and I think I was looking at Chester Beatty manuscripts. So that must have been the Chester Beatty collection. I don't know. But anyway, I took a bunch of pictures. You can do that, but you can also go online and just see thousands of pictures of these manuscripts because everybody else is doing the same thing. So I was a fanboy. I didn't get any pictures of myself with the manuscripts, like I was showing you earlier, and I highlighted before, Tom, I don't know if you weren't here for that. I don't know if you know this, but it's amazing how many women are into this kind of thing with the Bible. And so there's always, they're taking selfies of themselves next to this great manuscript and so forth. So it's this pattern I've recognized. I'm just going, why? Anyway, all right. So Chester Beatty papyrus fragments. Let's take a look at this a little bit. These are dated. Okay, I got a confession to make. I'm a real skeptic of AI, but it takes a long time to do what you see here in front of you. And so I thought, you know what? I want to expand out the 100s to the 400s and have that be a single timeline. So I took this thing. That's why I was texting Laura and Robert about ChatGPT, whether I should get a subscription. I would consider it a great defeat if I ended up getting a subscription, but it may happen. Anyway, I put this in and I said, hey, I want to create a timeline of the 100s to the 400s. And, I want to pull that out. And so it took this thing and it looked at it and gave some recommendations, told me how great I was, because ChatGPT is not going to tell you how great, not going to tell you how terrible you did something. This is terrible. Let me redo it for you. This is great. Let me give you a couple of enhancements, and then it changes the whole thing or something. But anyway, so it took this thing and expanded out the 100s to the 400s. Do I have it open here? Yeah, so it's kind of embarrassing. I don't know what I think. I feel like I've degraded myself for doing this, but I don't know what I think of it. This is what it came up with in like 10 seconds. There's a little too much flower that really isn't me, about with this down here, for example, this stuff down at the bottom. So I said, no, don't do that. That's not me. Everybody will laugh at me if I leave that up. It had a big fancy cross right here up on a hill. And it says, nah, it's not me either. Get rid of that. Put a regular cross there. It had a picture of Jerome over here, looking at a Bible, looking at writing the Latin. It's not me either. So I haven't changed the thing. I left the coin because I'd love to have a Constantine coin. We'll get back to him. Anyway, this is how it did it. And I'm gonna go ahead and use it for now. It's a little busy. I've always thought mine are kind of busy, but that's pretty busy too. So I don't know if I'm going to keep it. Let me go back to this for a second. What? You can't see the second one? I'll have to hand it out. Yeah, it really is. The young guy can see it. So. Okay, let's go look at this for a second. There's 3 colors on this. I always get accused of using too many colors. So I finally put a legend on it in the middle up there because I don't have anywhere else to put it. So what you're seeing is the Greek transmission of the New Testament writings, the Latin transmission of the New Testament writings, and then you'll notice that both terminate basically with Wycliffe. And then it's orange. And orange is total chaos, meaning it goes into any language it wants to. There's this loss of what we can call the loss of the gatekeeping. This world has run on gatekeepers in almost every way. So you have publishing houses, HarperCollins, pick Cambridge, pick them, and they choose if you want to get published. It used to be the case, if you want to get published, you have to go to one of these big publishing houses. And if they won't publish you, you don't get published. Well, that ain't gonna last, because I can make a book and I can self-publish. And that's exactly what happens now. So the gatekeeping came down. There's no longer a publishing gatekeeper for literature. Movies. Does Columbia Pictures and MGM, do these big places own the movie making? If you want to make a movie, do you have to go grovel before Columbia Pictures or somebody to make these? No. Angel Studios. They just pop up and you make the movie. And if nobody will release it, you just put it on YouTube. And that's what happened with that movie that just came out. The revenge movie in Europe. What's the name of the movie? No. There's a revenge movie that just came out that the European authorities, the gatekeepers, didn't like because it presented a picture of what's going on over there in a negative light for them. And so they wouldn't give it a rating. And since they couldn't give it a rating, the guy who made it couldn't get it out into theaters. Well, Elon Musk said, well, I can take care of that. So you could go online. Here, he gave it to them and, put it online. Well, the next thing you know, theaters pick it up because the theaters want to make money and Hollywood ain't cutting it. So they bypass the gatekeepers for the sake of expediency and survival. And they just put the movie Angel Studios. And it's the famous one from a few years ago. Sound of Freedom. Yeah. Sound of Freedom. It's exactly the same thing. That's set on a Disney shelf. Disney bought it, sat on a shelf for years before the gatekeeper held it for whatever reason. And then I don't remember what happened after that. They sold it or something. And then all of a sudden it made $200 million or something like that in theaters because the theaters just want to make money. Same thing's happening with this new movie. Somebody's got to find it. There, right there, these phones. The loss of gatekeeping. Music. Pick your old music label. When the Beatles first tried, before they became famous, their manager went around with Love Me Do, their first hit, couldn't find anybody to take it. You never would have heard of the Beatles. Finally found somebody, but they were having trouble with the gatekeepers. And then after a while, they finally figured out that they finally were able to get a hit, and then off we go. But these gatekeepers keep falling. And the gatekeepers keep trying to hold back the dam, trying to keep it together and do the gatekeeping, and it's not working. Why am I talking about all this? Gatekeepers.
The gatekeepers here, you're talking about the quality of the translations then, because now it's.
Latin. We'll talk about this, but you see that big yellow line? The Western Roman Church. I notice I did not say Catholic. We'll talk about this. The question of when you have a Roman Catholic Church is an open question. But the point is here that Latin Vulgate was a gatekeeper. It controlled access to the Bible for 1,000 years. Since Jerome, from the time Jerome wrote it, it was a magnificent work of scholarship from 405 to now it begins to crack the first time it gets translated. Wycliffe translated the Latin Vulgate into English, did not translate the Greek. But that simple act of rebellion starts the process. And the next thing you know, the gatekeeping comes tumbling down. And now the Bible is translated into any language people want it in. So there's a gatekeeper that held for a long, long time, but that finally came down. We'll talk about that later too. Okay. In the meantime, this period here, 100 to 400, or 100 to 325, let's call it the Edict of Milan 317, I think. I'll get back to that. This period right here is the opposite of that. It's uncontrolled. It's a period of uncontrolled copying. And that's what you're seeing with the Rylands fragment earlier that we already saw. Where did they find the Rylands fragment? And where in Egypt and what? A garbage dump. You get extra credit if you know the place. It's the most important archaeological site probably in the world. Oxyrhynchus. There's just thousands of them. There's hundreds of thousands of manuscript fragments that they found that it just takes time. You got to catalog them and photograph them and try to date them. All that stuff takes time. So they're still working. Who knows what's still waiting to be uncovered? We just happened to find this one fragment that's dated to the first half of the 100s. Well, there might be 50 of those down there in one of those crates. We just haven't gotten to it yet. So but anyway, if this is the opposite of gatekeeping, this is uncontrolled. And so we see that where this manuscript has made its way to Egypt in an uncontrolled, whoever did it, we have no idea. Did he write it did he copy it? Let's say John wrote in Asia, let's say it was Asia Minor. We have no idea. Well, no, we don't have no idea. We have some idea. And then it traveled to Egypt, or did he copy it in Egypt? If so, then there was already a copy in Egypt for him to copy off of. Let's just say it was the latter, which seems to me a lot more likely because you don't just travel hundreds and hundreds of miles all the time back in the day. And so let's just go with the idea that that was a copy made from a copy that was also in Egypt. And at some point you had a copy that traveled from the original location somehow until you arrive at this little Rylands fragment. However many generations, maybe very few generations of copying, because we're only talking about 40, I mean, depending on how you calculate it, 40, 50 years from John, off of John's pen to this manuscript. It's not hundreds of evolutions. It's probably a relatively few. But anyway, so you have now the evidence that there's this copying tradition happening and copying family of manuscripts happening in Egypt. And so whatever came to Egypt, whatever copy came to Egypt with its errors, because nobody's perfect, apostolic, the writers aside, in terms of writing, they're going to make errors. When you copy a book like John, I don't remember how many words it is, you're going to make errors. There's no question about it. So now you have in Egypt a family tree of copies because the one you have has errors in it. They don't have to be deliberate. They don't have to be serious. Misspelling, the copyist was here. He went over to look at the thing he's copying from, and when he came back, he found the same word down here, so he skipped the line and started there, or the other way around, I guess. But there's all kinds of different ways this can happen. Well, those errors then make their way into any copies from that copy. And so the next scribe has got to go, man, this word is misspelled. So he's going to look at it and he's going to do his own text criticism. He's going to do his own scholarly work. He's probably not going to copy the spelling error. So he's going to fix it. Or he's going to copy it as is, and he's going to put a little note off on the side explaining what he thinks really should be the case. And these manuscripts are full of this stuff. That's one of the reasons they have margins. Is you'll see these margins, you'll see writing between the lines where he's explaining, I think this or whatever the case is. And so you have then this family tree coming from this lineage of manuscripts where you can identify the family by its errors or by its readings, by the way that by the wording of this, by its wording of this particular verse. Because over here, let's just say in Rome, you've got a manuscript over there, completely different family. Some manuscript made its way to Rome and people started copying. Different set of variants, different misspellings, different mistakes, and so on and so forth. So you can, let's just say, you got one of each. And you could put them next to each other and you're going to make a copy. But now you have two manuscripts to compare. You got to make a choice. Well, I got this reading over here, and I got that reading over there. Well, this one, I don't think so. I'm going to choose this one. And then the scribe might put a reason that he did what he did. But that's coming in the future when you have professional scribes. For now, these guys just want to copy for their liturgy, for their church, for their gatherings. So they're just going to copy because that's all they got. Unlikely you're going to have two copies. So you just copy. But now you have a family tradition. Same thing is happening in Rome. Same thing is going to happen in what will eventually become Constantinople, which will eventually become Byzantium. We'll talk about that. It's going to create three different traditions of manuscripts, three different families, three different sets of related but different manuscript traditions. And then we're going to inherit all of it. We're going to inherit fragments and larger sections of all of it. And then somebody's got to put this together and come up with the Greek New Testament that we have that we can translate into English or any other language. That's the project. Anyway, it's interesting that we found this manuscript fragment in Egypt. Egypt will become, for your purposes, the most important copying of the New Testament, because your Bible is largely a reflection of that copying that went on. It's called the Alexandrian text, that copying that went on in Egypt, that family tradition. We'll talk about that later. But anyway, we have early representations of that text type. It's called a text type. So we'll only talk about three, which you don't really care about: Alexandrian, Western, which is Rome, Eastern or Byzantine text type, choose your words, with Constantinople. We'll look at this and we'll look at it right now. You have going to end up with three families of types. Imagine a copy in Egypt, copies in Egypt, and everybody copies over there. Kind of insulated. Copies in Rome, they copy from there, insulated. Copies in Byzantium or Constantinople, and it's kind of insulated, and so forth. Those of Antioch and Jerusalem will fall out, and it'll be these three centers of manuscript copying that we will see today as three different families or text types of manuscripts. This one is the one that stands behind your English translation. Alexandrian. It is the one that probably the vast majority of scholars, I don't know. Everybody wants to write a PhD, so if you want to, you don't have to be writing anything that's true to write a PhD. You can write about the space aliens of Alpha Centauri as long as you make a good case for it. It doesn't make any difference. But this is going to create a tremendous conflict within the church, because the King James Version is not going to come from this text type, from this family. The King James Version is going to come from this one, the Byzantine. And there's far more manuscripts of the Byzantine text type. That's why they call it the majority text, the Byzantine text type, than there is of the Alexandrian text. And we'll talk about why that is the case later. But anyway, the point is, how old are these text types? How far back do these copies go? And what we see with, where was I? Here. What we see with Bodmer and Chester Beatty is we see Alexandrian text types. Almost by definition, I guess, John would be, although they don't have enough to really I'm sorry, the Rylands fragment. It's found in Egypt, but if it was, where did it come from? We don't know. But these two, based on their readings, because we have enough of these two sets of manuscripts to be able to identify the text type. So we can actually, they can actually compare these manuscripts from about 175 to 225, somewhere in here. I just rounded it to 200. We can actually compare that to the great uncials that we'll talk about right here, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, which largely is reflected in our new Greek New Testament. We can actually see the lineage, see the similarities between these two. So they can identify that Bodmer and Chester Beatty those papyrus fragments come from this Alexandrian text type. And these are the books that are represented. None of them are complete, because papyrus, you're not going to find a whole papyrus, all the leaves. A page is a leaf. A leaf is a page. You're not going to find the whole thing. It just breaks down. There's no way. So it's all fragmentary. And I actually pulled up, they have it all online. It's been all photographed, which is a magnificent, where is it at? I pulled up, that's Bodmer. Here's Chester Beatty. This is their library online. This is great. How come I can't go backwards? Well, anyway, it looks really funny. Chester Beatty. Oh, here it is. Chester Beatty, Bodmer Papyri, Wycliffe Bible Publication, Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's awesome. Anyway, here you can see the fragments. This is what they're dealing with. That's a lot of text right here from 2 Corinthians. You can get a pretty good idea of the text type, right? Of the variants and so forth from that big of a section. But that's right. This is considered a big section of text to be, what do you call it? One continuous text. Some of them are really small, Anyway, I pulled out, this is which one is this? It's the only one we're going to look at. It's the Luke John transition. Gooby. Douglas Moo, I had him for intermediate Greek exegesis in 1999 and 2000, summer of 99, I guess. And he was talking about this and exactly that issue. And he said, I still remember it. He said, if you give me any manuscript of the New Testament, any, I will be happy to live my life by it. And I'll give you the evidence of that. I'll just a preview. What they call the critical text, that's the New Testament that's the Greek New Testament that your English translation is made from. This is the 28th edition of it. So lest you think it's static, this is the 28th edition. So the Greek text of the New Testament that stands behind your English has been revised 28 times. Actually, really. No, this is called the critical text. This is basically the Alexandrian text. Yeah. This is the text type that would trace its roots backward to probably Chester Beatty and Bodmer and so on and so forth.
Some translations start on that, but it doesn't matter.
Okay, so the question is, what are our translations made from? And in English, other than the King James Version and the New King James Version, as far as I know, all of them are made from the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament. Some, depending on how old it is, some edition of the Nestle, probably the 26th or greater. So now we get to the King James. Now the King James, where did that come from? So we're way ahead, but Have you heard anybody when they're reading King James? Have you been looking while you've been King James over here and English Standard over there and gone, wow, that's so different. I don't know what to make of Christian theology here. I mean, who knows? I'm thrown into total confusion. So the King James is a Byzantine text type manuscript. We'll talk at length about it later. It's a Byzantine text type. It's way over here. It's really not at 1611. If you're reading the King James right now, little poorly kept secret. It's actually, I think it's actually the third edition. It's the 1769 version. So if you're gonna say, if you hear, hey, the 1611 version of the King James is the standard, it's the inspired version, it's fine, but you're not reading it. You're reading the third.
The 1611 version also included the Apocrypha,
It did?
which is in the Catholic 2A Bible.
I didn't know that.
We would not say is inspired.
The 16 Tom's saying the 1611 version includes the Apocrypha. So, yeah, but anyway, the point is,
KJV only 1611,
yeah,
then you're Apocrypha.
yeah, we'll talk a lot more about that. But anyway, the point is, this text tradition is the Byzantine. That's the Byzantine or the majority text tradition. And we'll have to talk about why there's such a controversy between the Byzantine, there are people who believe they're majority text advocates. They believe that the Byzantine text type, the majority text, the one that stands underneath the King James, that tradition is the one that we should be using. Then there's people that think there's totally Alexandrian. That's Westcott and Hort, the great devils of the King James only movement. We'll talk about them later. They created a Greek text off of Sinaiticus. I think that's Alexandrian in the late 1800s, which is going to basically result in the overthrow of the King James as the authorized version. The authorized version, the received text, that's the Greek that's too much for now. But this becomes this is a major issue, not for me. I don't care what you read any of them. I listen to the King James version all the time because I like Alexander Skirby. Nobody like him.
About the Hawaiian Pigeon Bible.
The Hawaiian Pigeon. I just heard about that.
Did you?
Yeah.
Love it.
I can't say anything intelligent about it, but I was listening to stuff online. The Hawaiian Pigeon Bible. It's just another translation into the what constitutes the common language? Well, the common language is whatever is spoken on the street. So Greek, the New Testament was written in Koine Greek. It's not a magic word. Koine is just simply the word for common, the common Greek. It wasn't written in classical Greek, the Greek of the academic, the Greek that Plato would have used. It was Koine. So, Latin Vulgate. Why did he do that? Why did Jerome translate into Latin? Not so that nobody else could read it. It's exactly the opposite. What does Vulgate mean? Vulgar, but the old version, common, the vernacular, the common language. He was doing it so people could read it. Because it's the Western church, it's not the Eastern church. It's a Latin church. So he translates it into Latin so people can read it. Then all kinds of things happen, but not from Jerome's standpoint in the 4th and 5th centuries. None of which I wanted to talk about today. Total mess here. So talk about no gatekeeping. Let's go back and finish this off with these papyrus fragments. Sure. Pigeon Bible. Well, they won't be able to. They won't be able to hear that, Vic. They won't be able to hear that. I can't hear it. You'd have to read it, but we'll look at it next week. Anyway, this is, I think, this is Chester Beatty, or is this Bodmer? I forgot now. But anyway, it doesn't matter, really. You can see the transition. No, you probably can't. This is gospel according to Luke. And then this is gospel according to John. So they must have done exactly what we would have done. You don't waste this stuff. You don't even wait for a new page. We would put it on the next page. So if the end of Luke is here on this page, well, John in our Bible is not even going to be on the back of it. John will be on the next page here, right? That's just how we do it. But that stuff's precious. You don't do that. So what you have here is gospel according to Luke, and that appears to me to be the end. I can't read this unsealed stuff. This capital letter stuff with no line, no breaks between. I don't know who thought of that. That must be what constitutes a period for them. And then you pick right up with John. That's in the beginning. There's the word in there, logos, right here, I think. But you can just see the trend. This is how they did it. No breaks. Kind of, it's all caps, but it's written by a guy who's not a professional writer. You will see professional writing when we get to Sinaiticus. And it looks like somebody typed it. I mean, it is that perfect because they're professional scribes. So that's what's going to happen later. Okay. Let's so that's Chester Beatty and Bodmer papyrus. We've got lots and lots of this stuff from this period. Uncontrolled. The important thing is it's uncontrolled. It's street level. People just want a copy. Nobody's publishing anything. I want to publish this so it can, when Luke wrote his gospel in Acts, let's pick another one, Mark, he wasn't imagining, I don't think, probably, that he was publishing something for the world. Because that's copying. There's no printing press. You're writing it for an audience, which, as I've said before, creates demand. Other churches want it. So the copies are made and off we go. It's expediency. It's all you have, so you copy. But we have all kinds of this stuff. It's numbered. If you go online, you'll see it starts at P1, which is, I think, a section of Matthew. That's the first one published. These are P66 and P75. That's Bodmer. 45, 6, and 7 are Chester Beatty, I think. That's the order that they were published, not the order that they were found. But you can look at the last number. I didn't do that. And you can see the last piece. They go on for centuries. Because just because you start doing parchment codices, professional stuff, which we'll get to in the 300s, doesn't mean people aren't copying. They're still copying on papyrus. They're still doing all that stuff. But there's another element to Christian copying of their books. And that is, this stuff right here is all book form. It's not papyrus scrolls. Papyrus scrolls were actually considered this more scholarly professional thing. So the Great Isaiah Scroll from the Dead Sea finds, that's a scroll where you have two, what do you call them? That you're winded on? There's a word for that piece of wood, dowel, whatever that is. That's how they worked. But the Christians didn't do that. They were almost surely among the first adopters of the book form. It was the Latin, I think, is codex. We call them books, but the book form with pages, only it's codex with leaves. A leaf is a page. So when you go online and you look for this stuff, it'll say it says 3 leaves from this, and this one and so forth. And they're talking about pages. And so that's what the Rylands fragment is, John 18. Some of it's on the front, and then it continues on the back of the page, the leaf. And so immediately we know that's not a scroll. They didn't write on the back of scrolls. That's a book. So the Christians were among the first to adopt this, and may have undoubtedly been the ones who popularized it as a professional form of writing. Okay, I don't think I want to talk much more. We can talk about canon later. I want to keep going on manuscripts. We have to talk about what books. How do we end up with 27 of them? and which 27. So we'll do that after we talk, when we're talking about Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which are almost certainly the two most important manuscripts we have, which we may get to right now to close this out. Any thoughts or questions about this period of transmission right here? I'm trying to think of anything else I want to say about it. We'll go back and talk a little about Gnosticism. Say again? Yes. So we go back. Were they doing this also with the Old Testament? Remember, the Christians weren't creating a new scripture out of nothing. They already had it. If you have the quotations in Matthew, this is what was spoken of through the prophet so and so. Well, you need the prophet so and so. So they had as their word of God what we call the Old Testament, but the Bible, the scriptures, period. What Paul says, what does the scripture say? He's referring to the Hebrew tradition. So this was added on to that. And you can see, yes, but the question is, what version, what Hebrew Bible? Because they didn't know Hebrew. What did they know? They knew Greek. So what did they use? What Bible did they use for the Old Testament? Septuagint. Thank you, Jewish scholars. Like I said, it's one of the great ironies of biblical history that the finest of Jewish scholarship in Alexandria is going to produce a Bible of the Hebrew of the Israelite tradition that will then be taken over and used by the biblical writers like Paul and by the churches, and they will continue to copy that, except that Greek text of the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. And so you can see that in the Chester Beatty collection. When you go down this stuff, let's start at the beginning. It's a really slow site. A lot of images. There's Deuteronomy. Look at it. Deuteronomy, Psalms, Isaiah, but all fragmentary. Genesis, more Deuteronomy, Esther, Ezekiel. It's almost random, these pieces. Okay. That takes, we'll talk about I've got this here, which I also used. This is so embarrassing. I used AI for this too. I did tell, hey, I don't want Thucydides. I thought I changed that to Josephus. This is the wrong one. Anyway, you don't care. We'll talk about this later. This comparison of, you've heard this stuff, you might have heard this stuff or read it in books. New Testament does pretty well as historic. And we'll talk about, I mentioned historical skepticism last week, where you had these a certain scholar, but a certain school of scholarship, New Testament scholarship, that basically argues that you can't know anything about the original writings because the scribes changed the text so much, and sometimes deliberately, that we just simply don't know. It's this thoroughgoing historical skepticism, to which I argue, then throw it all away. We don't know anything about the past. Throw it all away. We'll talk about that later. Yes, as soon as I decide on it. As soon as I settle on it, yeah. Yeah. Well, that takes us to, we'll stop with Constantine. How many people have heard of Constantine? If you haven't, and you're a Christian, he's the most important Christian claiming person. Let's say it that way. I don't know. You've never heard of. So what happened was,
He legalized Christianity.
he did. If you can name the edict and what year.
Oh, wait. I can't tell.
Yeah, the extra credit was, can you name the year and the edict that happened that transformed the situation for the church? It's 317, and it's called the Edict of Milan. Constantine was a general one of the great Roman generals, who was actually a general, if you wonder why Milan, he was actually a general in the West. And he took a lot of these thrones were taken through conflict. It's amazing how many. Caesar destroyed the Roman Republic by basically attacking Pompey, who was the great Roman general in defense of Rome. But anyway, unless I got that wrong. He becomes emperor, and in 317, prior to 317, there was a emperor named Diocletian who launched, I think it's well established now, the most ferocious persecution of Christians, which also included destroying these writings. So don't think destroying Bibles, because nobody had one. They had whatever they had. But he was hostile to Christianity for a number of reasons, which we can talk about later. But he eventually, ironically, this doesn't happen very often, he retired, I believe. And not a lot of emperors retired. They either they died, whether it be by natural causes or poison or assassination. You know, Nero and Claudius, and who's the first one? Caligula. They all died unnaturally, probably. But anyway, he died. Constantine took the throne. They're still in the West, Rome. And one of his first actions, the claim is by him that he saw a vision of the cross. I'll learn more about it, but it's this famous thing. And he was converted to Christianity. There's lots of debate about whether he really did. Doesn't really matter. The point is that with the Edict of Milan, Christianity became legal. So the persecution that had preceded it came to this abrupt end, instantaneously. And not only did it end, he didn't legalize it in the name of freedom of religion and go on about his merry way. He legalized it, and then it became state sanctioned and kind of the state religion. So it went from heavily persecuted to the flavor of the month. And so all these people all these leaders, becoming a bishop in a city like Rome or anywhere else at that point was kind of a death sentence. I mean, these guys gave it all, no matter what you think of their theology. There's no doubt about their sincerity. They're not doing it for riches or any of that, because there was none. But when he legalized it, he then turned it all around, and it became the unifying force in the empire. So that's why you get up first, there's 7 years in between, but 8 years, the Council of Nicaea in 325. Because all these bishops are now arguing, what's the right theology? Who was Jesus really? You have the Arians who are saying Jesus wasn't really God. There's still Gnostics out there probably. You got all these different flavors, if you will, of what we consider heretical schools of, offshoots of Christianity. And so with the Council of Nicaea, he said, enough of this. All you bishops get in here, and we're going to settle the question of the deity of Christ. That was Constantine. And whether Christ, let's go with that, the deity of Christ. Ironically, a bishop who was not there is the bishop in Rome. He sent representatives. He was not at Nicaea. Historical irony. But anyway, with Nicaea, they now begin to establish what you would consider they recognize a canon of theology. This is what we're about. And these bishops settle on this. And then within a few years, he is going to say, okay, I want Bibles. We got to get this out to the churches. So I'm going to commission that 50 Bibles through a man named Eusebius. I want 50 Bibles printed. Well, as soon as you say I want 50 Bibles, you have to establish on what constitutes a Bible. What's the books? There's no discussion of that. It just says I want the Bible. I want 50 of them. Professional scribe, you get all the money you want. Professional scribes, parchment, which is animal skins, very, very expensive. beautifully ordained, probably, all this, or adorned. But now you have that going from the persecution to this situation, and it happens very nearly overnight. And so we will talk about Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, because the transformation in the writing between the parchment, the papyrus, and Vaticanus and Sinaiticus is shocking. The difference is unbelievable. So we'll talk about those works and then get into, there's not much more to say about that, and then we'll talk about canon. Then it would be the time to talk about the canon, because what about the books? Now they have to be what's getting collected. So we'll stop right there. Questions or comments? Now I got to go look up, what is it? The Hawaiian parrot language? Hawaiian Pidgin version. All right. And we're going to shut down.
Whatever you do, it works.